All right. Thank you all for coming. Tonight's genealogy class is using church and cemetery records to research your ancestors. Before we begin, hold on, here we go. We acknowledge that the Boston Public Library's Central Library stands on land that was once a water-based ecosystem, providing sustenance for the indigenous Massachusetts people, and is a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among nations. We are committed to land acknowledgements for all locations at which we operate. We reaffirm this commitment to set the context for our planning. Deliberations and public engagement will take place from the spirit of welcome and respect found in our motto, free to all. So just a couple of more things to go through before we get going. I'm putting a link to the handout into the chat here. So anyone who didn't get a chance to download it can do so now. The chat box is open, so feel free to say hi to each other, or if you have any questions for me, pop them in there. I will have plenty of time to answer questions at the end of my presentations. This class is being recorded. I will be sending a link to everyone once it is ready up on our YouTube channel. You will also be getting a follow-up email from me tomorrow that will contain links to the handout in case you miss it, as well as links to to my slides, as well as to the chat transcript. So if anything interesting comes up in the chat, everyone will be getting a transcript of that as well. So for those of you who do not know me, you're new, I'm Jessie Wheeler. I'm the genealogy specialist here at the Boston Public Library, and I work in the Research Services Department. So today we are covering, as I said, how to use church and cemetery records to research your ancestors. So this is just a brief overview of what we're covering, which first, we're going to go over a brief history of religion in Massachusetts. This presentation is going to be primarily focused on Boston and Massachusetts, just because that's where the BPL is, and that's what we have more resources for. We're going to cover some general resources, including books and some databases. And we're going to go in depth on church records and then some cemetery records. Okay, so brief history of religion in Massachusetts. A lot of you might know some of this stuff, but for those of you who are visiting us from elsewhere, this is mostly for you. So Congregationalism was the most prominent denomination dating from the earliest settlement in the 1600s all the way through the late 1700s. So many historic churches started out as congregational churches. So pretty much all of the churches that were founded back then in the 1630s, when Boston and Massachusetts was first settled, those were congregational churches. If they are still around, they might be different denominations now. In fact, many of them are, but they started out as congregational. So along those lines, people that were adherents of other faiths, they were just called heretics. So they were shunned, exiled, and occasionally executed. A lot of you might know Quakers had a particularly hard time, as well as Catholics. I think Quakers had a little bit more of a hard time. Both denominations were banned from Massachusetts for many, many years. A lot of Quakers and other so-called heretics wound up resettling in Rhode Island. So Catholics were more tolerated slightly after the Revolutionary War. That's largely, we have George Washington to thank for that, because he didn't want to annoy the French Catholic allies and the Irish soldiers that were fighting for him. So after the Revolutionary War, once the U.S. Constitution was adopted that guaranteed religious freedom in the country, so Catholics were allowed and other religions began to be tolerated. That's maybe liked so much, but at least not illegal anymore. And thanks to a huge uprising in Irish immigration, Catholicism eventually became the most dominant religion in Massachusetts over Congregationalism or other Protestant denominations. So this is largely in the 19th century when that starts to happen. So that's why there's going to be a lot more resources available for Catholic records in Massachusetts. So just some general resources. You'll notice here, as you go through my slides, we'll have some pictures of some old historic churches in Boston. This is Old North. I believe that's the second steeple. So before it was destroyed by Hurricane Carol back in the 50s. So we do have a lot of books related to church records, cemetery records at the BPL. These are just a small sampling of a few of them. So this book right here, Preachers, Patriots, and Plain Folks, gives a narrative history of some of the oldest cemeteries in Boston, including Central Burying Ground, which is that little burial ground on the Common, the Granary, and King's Chapel. So they do have some records. They have maps. This is a pretty cool book. I have actually used it quite a bit. I highly recommend just looking through it, even if you're not doing research about this. That's one of the more interesting things we have that, again, I just like looking through it sometimes when I'm bored. And then we have a few other books, particularly related to Massachusetts. One of the ones that might be more useful to you is if you're looking for congregational records. As like I said, most churches early on in Massachusetts history were congregational. So there was a survey done in the late 1960s of where some of these records are. Again, this was published in 1970, so it might not be 100% accurate anymore, but it can still be useful. That can kind of give you a guiding point as to where you can find those records. So we also have a few databases that might be useful. The big one is, of course, Ancestry Library Edition. They do have church records, which includes histories. They do have books on there. A lot of people don't know that. And they'll have records like, for instance, christenings, baptisms, marriages, burials and deaths, eating minutes, a whole bunch of really cool things. So we're just going to take a quick look at this. So if you go into our subscription for Ancestry while you're in the library, if you scroll down to the bottom here, you can see there's a link here, schools, directories, and church histories. So if you're looking for a church history, you can find it there. If you're looking for a baptism, they will be in the birth, marriage, and death records section. So let's just take a quick look at this one. So this will just give you a little more history here. So as it says here, the church histories and records, they could have parish records. So in some cases, if they have a book from a particular parish, they might have lists of members. So that's what some church histories might have, is actual records of who was part of the church in a given year, and also who the pastor was, and things like that. These can be pretty useful if you have the name of the pastor, if you found them in a marriage record, you can maybe find out more about what they did. Another big one, again, particularly for Catholic records, is American Ancestors. Just as, again, this one you can only use our subscription at the Central Library, but you can also, much like Ancestry, you can get your own subscription if you're interested. However, they do have a free database of Catholic records. They have an agreement with the Boston Archdiocese, and they're slowly digitizing their records. So you can actually access a lot of those for free. They also have, pretty similar records as Ancestry. They'll have marriage records, they'll have church admissions, sometimes excommunications, baptisms, and burials. These, again, will come largely from the church record books. So if these books have been digitized and they're in there, you can try searching those. So then we're going to take a quick look at that. So if you go into AmericanAncestors.org, you click on the search button up at the top left here. And I just like to click on Go to Search to make things a little bit easier. And then over here under Record Type, you can pick whatever you're looking for. So if you're looking for a baptism, you can do that. You can look for cemetery records there. They'll also have a thing called church admission and dismissal. So these were things when someone moved to an area and they were entered into the church, or if they moved somewhere else or did something that displeased the congregation, you could see when they were dismissed. They have a lot of, you can see here, they have a ton of church records in here. And they also have, if someone was excommunicated, Eucharistic records. There's really a wealth of information here. Again, most of them coming from digitized records from the actual churches that were in here. So let's see if we want to just think of a generic name here. Let's just let's just see what comes up. Okay, so let's see. So here we go. Here's something from Dedham Church Records. So we're going to click on that and take a look and see what that is. So if we click on, so this will tell you, this will give you a transcription, a basic transcription of what's in there, but I always like to click on view so I can look at the image of the original record. Sometimes you get more information that way. So you can see here, a lot of published church records will look like this. They're often arranged in loose chronological order. Sometimes you can see here, that's what these are. So sometimes they're in alphabet, sometimes they'll be separate sections for years, and then they're in alphabetical order by last name. So it really kind of depends. So this will tell you when each person was admitted. So the random name that we looked up, let's see if we can find him. There we go. So on December 7th, 1766, he was admitted with his wife, Margaret. That's another reason why these can be useful. If you were looking for William Smith and now you know, oh, his wife's name was Margaret. So that's something you might not have known before. And then you know approximately when they might have arrived in Dedham, which would have been around so late in the year of 1766. So that's just one of the few little things that you can find in church records. We also have a section of our genealogy research guide, which I like to promote in everything I do. We have a detailed church record section. So we're going to be going over a lot of the things in this guide during this class, but this will just go into even more depth. You get a lot more links than what we'll be able to talk about here, more books. So definitely take a look at this if this is something you're researching later. Okay, now we're going to look at some church records. This picture is of Old South Meeting House. This is right after the Great Fire of 1872, which it just barely survived. You can see the fire stopped basically right across the street from it. They put in a lot of effort to save it, and fortunately they did. So for church records, we're going to talk about just in general some good things to know. So as we've just been looking at, a lot of church records have been published in book form and are pretty easily accessible. They've been transcribed and organized in such a way that they can be pretty easily researched rather than looking through the handwritten ledgers. Those can be kind of tricky. Those type of records, those handwritten ledgers, they're unpublished church records. They may not be considered public. Church records are not technically public records, so they don't have to make them available. So they might not necessarily be accessible. That being said, most churches do make their records available. One of the things you really need to keep in mind, if you already know which church a person attended, or like if you have a really good idea, and if that church is still in existence, your best bet to find church records for that area is to contact the church directly. Again, they don't technically have to make them available to you, but most of them will. So it's definitely worth a shot if the church is still open and you know your ancestor or relative went there. Along those lines, that's just if the church still exists. Churches can move, the congregations can move, the buildings may get destroyed, they might have to go to another place, they might change their name, they might merge with another congregation or several other congregations, so that can make it a little hard to track. So what you would need to do is try to trace the history of the church that you're looking for and find out what happened to it. So in that case, you would need to do some legwork and do some research into the church. So information about churches, can be found in things like city directories. And a lot of them, there'll be a section and one either in the front or the back listing the churches, whatever city it is. They'll often be in phone books too. And there are also church directories, which we're going to take a look at a few of them in a little bit. The other thing you can do is try searching if you're looking for a church that was in Boston or Massachusetts, try searching for the church's name in our catalog. You can access from bpl.org. So let's see if we can get this to work. Okay. So let's just say, for instance, you're interested in looking up records for Old South, the Old South Meeting House. Just type in a search for that. Then you can see what we have. You can see we'll have a few histories. We'll have some published sermons. And some of these histories have been digitized and you can read them online. And I'm not seeing any here. Then you can see just some eulogies. For churches this old, they will have a lot of published sermons. So if that's something that interests you, you can definitely take a look at that. And just and the histories, as I said earlier, they will often contain lists of the previous pastors, and in some cases, lists of all the members. And sometimes it just might be interested to look at, just to read the history of the church if you're interested in that. So we're going to talk first about some Protestant denominations. That is the Arlington Street Church. It's most famously known for its Tiffany stained glass windows. They do have tours on a limited basis. They are still there. For those of you who aren't familiar with the area, for those of you who don't recognize this is the intersection of Arlington and Boylston Street. So not that far from the BPO. You can tell it looks a lot different now than it did then. A lot more buildings built up around it now. So the most important resource, particularly if you're researching Boston church records, are the Record Commissioner's reports. These were things, there was an office called the Record Commissioner that was done in the mid-19th century. They were tasked with gathering all available birth, marriage, and death records from the time Boston was founded all the way up to 1849, which is when the commission started. And these records are largely drawn from church records. So we have a lot of different books, and we have a lot of different the relevant books. I linked to them here. These have all been digitized. You can look at every single one of these online, and we're going to take a look at that here. Your commissioners, there we go. So you can see here that in addition to vital records, birth, death, and marriage, there's also tax records, selectmen records, town records. These are particularly fascinating, I think, particularly around the time of the Revolutionary War. You can see kind of what was going on and what the atmosphere was like back then. We're going to take a look at this one, just so you all can see what it looks like. So Boston births from 1700 to 1800. And these are freely available online. Okay, let's make this bigger. There we go. Okay, we also do still have these in hard copy if you were to come into the building and if you're interested in looking at them. So let's make this a little bit bigger for folks. Okay. So this particular volume, this is organized first chronologically. So they'll have one section for each year and then alphabetically by last name. However, they put the last name at the end of each line, which makes it a little tricky to find it, but it is in alphabetical order. You just have to look at the end of the line at the beginning of the line, because it will start off with the name of the person born, son or daughter, and then the parents' names. You can see there's quite a lot going on here later on in this font, so let's just skip ahead. So we can see here. And see here just how it goes on and on and on. This is a pretty big volume. So at the beginning, there should be, in this explanation here, and this little bit at the beginning, it should say where exactly this information was come from. Let's see. Okay, so this is actually, okay, so I'm not sure where exactly they got this from, but some other volumes, if you read the front matter, it'll tell you where all the records came from. And in many cases, they will be from church records. This is also true for published vital records. It'll tell you at the beginning where they came from. So then you can figure out what church they came from and how, and so that can tell you what church your ancestors went to. That's one of the better resources for looking at Boston births. However, there are other resources that you can use. Most of the major Protestant denominations, there's some kind of archive that will have information and they can help you research. The Baptist Historical Society has a genealogy section on their webpage. There we go. So they'll tell you what they can help you with, what they can't help you with, and what they have available. So they have, so this, for instance, they have their own archive. Not all denominations are going to be organized in such a way that they have their own archive. Some places, such as the Unitarian Universalists, they have deposited their records at the Harvard Divinity School library. So if you wanted to look up, Unitarian records, you'd have to contact Harvard. Again, this will just tell you what all is in it. There's a bunch of different things in there, so that's fascinating stuff there. And let's see, the Episcopal Church also does have its own archive. There's also the Methodist Church. They have for the New England Conference of the United Methodist Church. Those are kept by the Boston University School of Theology. The Congregational Library and Archives, those are pretty major. That is located in Boston. As I said before, most churches in the colonial era were congregational, and the Congregational Library has a lot of records. So they have a lot of church records, records of particular people. They have manuscript collections. They have an enormous collection. So they can tell you a lot about what life was like during the early colonial era and what was going on, and how pastors and religious practices. So it's definitely an excellent resource. They have a number of things that have been digitized, so you can actually look at some stuff online. So this will tell you here, this little map, that'll tell you what exactly they have. So let's click on this here. So this will, they link to the Cape Ann Museum. That'll tell you other places that you can try that might have some records. So they have just a whole bunch of really great stuff on there. So this, again, we're going to talk a little bit more about this later, this sort of organization. But the Episcopal Church, each diocese will probably have its own archive. So this will be the Episcopal Diocese of Massachusetts. They have their own archive. And on their site, they'll explain to you what they have. There we go. How to request information, what kind of information they might have, and there's their contact info. And then this is another different way to do it. So the Massachusetts Historical Society also has some congregational church records, so those are kind of scattered. And the Lutheran denomination there's an archive for that. The Presbyterian Historical Society has Presbyterian related records. So as you can see, like I said, most major Protestant denominations, there's some sort of repository of their records somewhere. So the Presbyterian Historical Society has a genealogy and family history section, and they go over what they have, what they don't have, and how they can help you. Okay. So moving on, we're shifting over a little bit to the Society of Friends, better known as the Quakers. So this is the Quaker Meeting House in Salem, Mass. So there have been a few books published about them. Again, this is going to be focusing mostly on New England because that's what we have here is records for New England. So we have a book on the history of Quakers and Baptists in colonial Massachusetts. Quakers and Baptists were considered, and they would have been called heretics. They were considered particularly bad as far as the Congregationalists were concerned. So this is a pretty interesting history. If that's something you're interested in looking at, knowing the history of a time and place is, I think, a really good way to get a better idea of what your ancestors' lives were like. And if you can get a handle on the history, you can get a handle on them too. Okay, so I see. So again, here's another link to the handout for those of you who joined us a little bit late. There we go. There are also archives for the Quakers. So the New England Yearly Meetings of Friends records, those are at UMass Amherst. It covers from 1633 to 2018. See if this can load. This will load for us. There we go. So this is a very, very broad collection that they have. It covers over 300 years worth of Quaker meetings. So that's basically, they can tell you who belonged to which meeting during a year, where they might tell you where they lived, and it'll give you just some really good background on Quakers, particularly in New England. And then if you're interested in learning about how to research Quaker genealogy, there is a guide written by genealogist Sally Benny for the New England Historic Genealogical Society, which is another great resource. They have a lot of free guides on their site. So this will tell you other places you can look if you're looking in, outside New England. This can give you some help in figuring out where you need to go. This one, they have links here to other places for meetings in other areas, where to find church records, how to read the church records, and so on and so forth. They're a really great resource. Now we're going to go on to the Catholic Church, which, as I said earlier, was the dominant Christian denomination in Massachusetts. So there's a lot to cover. This here is the Mission Church in Roxbury, which I think is a beautiful building. So for those of you who may not be Catholic, who don't know, the Catholic Church is divided into provinces, dioceses, and archdioceses, and then into parishes. So in Massachusetts, there's one archdiocese that covers Boston and most of eastern Massachusetts. There's a diocese that covers Fall River, and then Springfield, and then Worcester. So then further subdivided into that are the parishes. So that's each individual church. So if you just want to get a handle on what parishes are in each diocese, I have put links in here to each diocese has their own website, and that will tell you which parish is where. So you can see here, this is Diocese of Springfield. So that covers a lot of Western Mass, which is where I'm from. So of course I wanted to look at that. So this will generally tell you this one's organized alphabetically by town, and then you have the names of the churches. It'll tell you when it was founded, where it is, the address, the phone number, and the mass schedule. I wouldn't put too much stock in the mass schedule. Things change a lot, so that might not be 100% accurate, but the rest of the information is pretty good. So the diocese or websites are generally all going to be organized like this, and also for elsewhere in the country. So there have been Catholic directories published for many, many years, which makes researching Catholic clergy a little bit easier than some other denominations. So we do still get the two current directories, the Boston Catholic Directory and the Official Catholic Directory that covers the whole United States. So all of these directories that I'm going to talk about, you can access through the book delivery desk, which is located at the Central Library, and I will have links to them when they're online. So some of the older volumes of this Official Catholic Directory are available online at Hathi Trust. A whole bunch of them were digitized, so you can actually take a look on here. So let's take a look at this one. All right, and Hathi, I will warn you, Hathi does load a little slowly sometimes, particularly when you're trying to look up a book. There we go, and let's see if this will come through for us. There we go. So this will also have a little explanation of how the hierarchy works. So let's keep going down here. Okay, and also has a list of popes, tell you who all the bishops were and archbishops were that year. So this one is organized by diocese and archdiocese. It'll tell you who is the bishop there, and then it'll tell you all the people, all the higher ups, and then it'll tell you the different. Then list all of the cities and towns covered by the diocese, and list all the churches and all the pastors, priests who were at that church in that particular year. So if you are researching, this is particularly useful if you're researching a priest, if you're trying to track where they were at a particular point in time. You would, however, need to have a general idea of at least what city they were in. So going back, we go back and back and back. Some of these are all essentially the same directory that we're talking about, just the name changed periodically. So from 1906 to 1912, it was called the Official Catholic Directory and Clergy List. 1900 to 1905, it was the Catholic Directory Almanac and Clergy List. Now this is where there was a split. There were initially like I said, the name changes from 1886 to 1899. It was Hoffman's Catholic Directory Almanac and Clergy List. And from 1856 to 1893, there was a different one called Sadlier's Catholic Directory, Almanac, and Ordo. The ones that we get today, these are basically the successors, pardon me, of the Hoffman's Catholic Directory. So these are all very, very old, and they are all online. So let's take a look at the Hoffmans. Okay, let's look at this one that they scanned from Boston College. Again, you know, Hathy takes a long time to load sometimes. You can see here, I always like looking at old books, and if you're lucky on Hathy, they will actually have the scanned book covers in here, and I just find that fascinating. Okay, so this one actually has a helpful table of contents. This will tell you the archdiocese, the diocese, what page numbers, what pages they're on. This one also covers Canada, so that's pretty cool if you're looking for Canada. They will also have information that was received before the book was published, that they couldn't get it into the place in time. They'll also have, this one also has a calendar. The really old ones will have calendars of when all the feast days were. So if you're curious about that, you can find that there. Let's skip ahead a bit. Okay, let's just go to page. Oh, you're being annoying right now. Come on. There we go. All right. So this is the Archdiocese of San Francisco that we randomly landed on. You can see, let's make this a little bit bigger. Come on now. No, you don't want to work today. There we go. Okay. So you can see here, there's the name of the parishes, the people who work there, the rector, the assistants. Basically, again, it's really helpful if you're trying to figure out where a priest was or who was the pastor at a church that you're looking at. And much like some of the other Protestant denominations that we talked about, the Catholic Church has their own archives. They are generally organized on a diocese basis. So the Archdiocese of Boston has its own archive. It is open for research, but by appointment only. It does actually have records for some individual parishes, and those are mostly covering 1930 and earlier. I will say, however, they can be kind of hard to get a hold of, so just keep that in mind if you're trying to get records from them. They can be take a little long to respond. You can see here, this will go over, they've redone this since the last time I was here. There you go. So this will have their contact information. They'll ask you to be very specific for what you're looking for. And you can also, if you poke around a little more, they'll actually tell you what exactly they have. They do not have everything though. We're gonna go into a little more into where other records are later. As I mentioned earlier, the New England Historic Genealogical Society has been digitizing historic records for the Archdiocese of Boston. So some of those are free. You do have to register for an account, but the account is free. They're not going to make you pay, and you don't have to come here. So they have a bunch of different records. Some of them you can only look at the images. And this will just give you an explanation of what everything is if you're not familiar with what it looks like. So let's see if we can pull up an example here for you. One of the interesting little quirks about this collection is earlier records were written in Latin. So that's kind of tricky to search. So let me see if I can find an example. Well, let's do William Carmen, which is my great-great-grandfather's name. There we go. Okay. Okay, so you can see here, this is an example. You can see here. Let's look at this record. This right here. So this is so they've done a really great job of translating the Latin names into, the actual person's name. So this person's name was Leon William Herman. The Latin version of that is apparently Leonem Guilelmum. Don't know how they came up with that. I don't know enough Latin. But at NASGS, they've been doing a really good job trying to translate that so you can actually find the person you're looking for. So that's one of the weird little quirks about the OLA records. They are in Latin. Another thing that's interesting, they are majority handwritten. That's why they've been working on this project for many, many years, and you can kind of see why here. It's all handwritten in Latin, so it takes a very long time to translate and transcribe. But they're still, again, I find them fascinating to look at. The ones that they've transcribed everything here. So this is a particular record is for baptism, and I'll tell you there who their parents are, the witnesses to the baptism, and what parish it was, and you'll have the date. So this is pretty cool. It is just for the Boston Archdiocese. I don't know if they have any plans to expand beyond that. So a little while ago, we looked at a directory that was digitized by Boston College, and it was likely held by the John J. Burns Library. So they have a really substantial collection for Catholic and also Jesuit records. So a lot of these are just books. They do have, let me see. So a lot of it is going to be history-like stuff. They do have some church books, so they'll have some church records if these were things that were written down. They have a manuscript collection and a music collection. It's a lot of really interesting stuff that they have at that library, including, of course, the directories and a bunch of other things. All right, now we're going to move on and focus more on cemetery records. This right here is Copp's Hill Burying Ground. That's up in the north end. It actually I don't know if it's quite the oldest. It's very close to the oldest burying ground in Boston. So it is a really interesting place to go. It's up you can't see it right here, but on one side is a very steep hill. So it's depending on what direction you're coming from, it can be a little hard to get up there. I know I was huffing and puffing the one time I went up there. Now for cemetery records, so there's some good things you should know. So for public cemeteries, so those would be cemeteries that are run by a city or a town. Those records will be held by the city or town in which they are located. And if in the case of historic cemeteries, again, like we've looked at before, the same with the church records, a lot of them will have published burial records. We have several here for the historic cemeteries in Boston. And just by way of definition, an active cemetery is a cemetery that still accepts new burials. Non-active cemeteries do not accept new burials. They're closed. No one else is going to be buried there. And so those are going to be most of the historic cemeteries are not currently active. So records for non-public cemeteries, those will be held by generally by the organization that operates them. So that could be the church or congregation that founded it, a church or congregation near the one that founded it, in the case that the congregation was dissolved or disbanded. And also in those cases, there could be organized by a nonprofit organization, or the records could be held by an archive for the religious denomination that founded it. So all the archives that we looked at for the Methodist Church, for the Baptist for the Quaker meeting, and so on and so forth, they might have those records. They're also, in the case of different organizations, there might be an office within the organization of a diocese focused particularly on cemeteries. So this is true for the Catholic Church, and some of the dioceses, there is an office that just has cemetery records and information. So there are a lot of online resources if you're looking for graves. Probably the most widely known one that I'm going to guess a lot of you have already looked at is Find a Grave. So this, much like Wikipedia, is based entirely on user submissions. So it's something you should take a grain of salt when you're looking at them. And their primary focus is virtual memorials. They like to have pictures with everything. And the other thing to know It is owned by Ancestry.com, which means it's also integrated with Ancestry.com, so you can actually find these records. They'll pop up in Ancestry.com. So for those of you who may not be quite as familiar with that, we're going to pop in my great-great-great-grandfather here. And so this, again, it's useful, particularly if the person has a common-ish name, if you can have a location. So I'm just going to put in Massachusetts. There we go. So this is the first one. So I can tell you that this was, both of these are my relatives here. So this is Hosea Wheeler. He died during the Civil War. So this is generally how a lot of them are going to be laid out. They'll have the person's name. Sometimes they'll put a rank. They were in the military or a doctor or whatever. And they'll have things like birth and death dates and locations if they know them, and where the burial is. And then if you're lucky, some kind of information down here. Sometimes people will paste in entire obituaries, which is kind of a no-no because obituaries, particularly more current ones, are actually copyrighted. So something to keep in mind. And if you're very lucky, you'll have a picture of the actual grave. So this is one for my 4 times great-grandfather. It's not terribly big, but the stone is not terribly big. So I can't really make that any bigger, but so this is just so you get an idea. This is a pretty typical entry for Find a Grave. There's also billion graves. That's another big one. Their focus is primarily on gathering images. One of their goals is to get as many pictures of headstones as possible. They also include GPS data with every entry. So let's click on them. Okay, so let's again, we're going to put in Hosea. Let's see what they come up with. Okay, there's a bunch of different people by that name. So what you want to do is refine that. So it was United States. The other cool thing about them is they have stuff from other countries. Find a Grave is primarily focused on the United States. Okay, Massachusetts, Berkshire County, and let's refine that. There we go. So it's not perfect, as you can see here. It just kind of comes up with everyone with the last name Wheeler in Berkshire County, and there's a lot. Not all of them are related to me, just a few of them. We're going to click on that because I believe this is his. Okay. So this will actually give you the address of the cemetery. And let's see if we can click on this. Oh, and then they want to make you sign in. I don't have an account here, so we're not going to be able to do that. So that is one little restriction that they have. But the one thing they have, they actually will have a map of where the grave is. So we'll open up a new tab. So it opens up a map. So if you happen to go there, you'll be able to find it. That just gives you a little hint of what is going on there exactly. You can see there's another cemetery nearby where a bunch of the rest of his family is buried. That's one of the good things about billion graves. And there's also Intermitnet. So unlike Find a Grave and Billion Graves, they are not focused on user submissions just from the general public. These entries are based on records that are contributed by professional genealogists, by the cemeteries themselves, by government agencies, and other private organizations. And they also have some specialized death indexes. With that, I mean, you can also browse here. So they have a collection for veterans cemeteries. They have a collection for flooded cemeteries, for people and for mass casualty events, they'll have listings for that. The heck of it, we're going to look for Hosea here and see what comes up. Okay, so they have quite a bit here. So we're going to have to go back. There we go. All right, so we're going to have to go to advanced search. I'm sorry. Okay, there we go. And where is advanced search? Okay, to be honest, I'm not quite as familiar with this one. All right, but let's just, okay, so let's just click on here. Okay. So you can get a sense of what this looks like here. So we can also do a browse. I'm gonna see if I can find, okay, Berkshire County. Okay, so they don't have a ton of stuff. So Hosea probably isn't in there. So this is there. I guess there just hasn't been anyone to submit it yet. But just so we can get a sense of what it looks like, let's click on a cemetery that is there. So you can see that here. So they'll have the cemetery done, and it'll have alphabetical list of names and their basic information here. But the they might not have as much in there as the other two, but it is going to be slightly more reliable because they do vet the sources before putting everything up. So it is a little bit more reliable. Okay, so now we're going to look at some more specialized resources. So this will be, this first one here is for for Jewish genealogy. So it has records from over 9,000 Jewish cemeteries that covers over 140 countries. There we go. You will have to have a register again for a free account before you can actually look like the records. But what you would do is type in your search thing here. But let's see. Let's do this one. Okay, let's just see what comes up. Okay, so this will tell you a bunch of different things. Again, they cover all over the world, so that's why it's particularly useful. A lot of these record resource websites will only have United States, but and so let's click on this one. Okay. Oh, okay, that's not what I meant to do. Okay. There we go. Okay, so you click on the button there that lists the number, and then now they're going to make you log in. So again, I don't have an account here, but once you get to that point, you'll be able to get pretty much a similar layout to Intermitnet with basically a little more information. So another specialized one is the nationwide gravesite locator that's done by the Veterans Administration in the United States. They do focus on national cemeteries. So that's going to be cemeteries where military veterans are buried. That is their primary focus. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to do a search for, okay, so we're going to try. Okay, so let's just search. Okay, so let's do the Massachusetts National Cemetery for Herman. So what this will tell you, this will have information. It'll have their name, it'll have their rank and their branch, the conflict that they served in, dates of birth and death, the exact location of their grave within the cemetery, and it'll give you information about where the cemetery is. The other interesting, cool thing about this is it will also have the spouses of the people, so that if they're buried with them, it'll have their information too. So this will tell you this person is Joseph M. Herman's wife, and he was in the Navy. So that is also pretty cool. So very similar along those lines is the American Battle Monuments Commission Burials and Memorials. So this is specialized in U.S. military casualties from World War I and World War II that are buried or memorialized overseas. So by memorialized, what we mean is there was no body to recover, so there's just a memorial for them somewhere. There's a there's a few of these, particularly large ones, I believe in the Netherlands, that have memorials for people who died military service who worked with the U.S. Armed Forces, but they were never able to find a body. But for this one, I don't have anyone in my family that I can look as anyone else. If anyone else has a family member who's buried overseas, feel free to pop their name in. Otherwise, I'm just going to type in a random name. Okay. Let's do or two. So let's see what happens here. Okay. Come on now. Okay, there we go. So this will come up with an alphabetical list. So it'll have a person's last name, they'll have their name, their rank, their service number, which can be very handy if you're trying to get their personnel records from the National Archives. It's a very good place to have it. Tell you what branch they were in, the conflict they were in, and where their memorial is or where they're buried and where they were from and even their unit. So this is really useful information if this is stuff that you didn't have before. And sometimes, and it'll also say their status. So if they were MIA, killed, missing in action, killed in action, it'll have that there. And it'll tell you, so this person is on the walls of the missing in Manila in the Philippines. So you got a really good amount of information about this person right here. All right, so a rough equivalent to what we have for the United States, there's also one called the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. That's for Commonwealth countries, so basically people from Australia, Canada, India, New Zealand, South Africa, and the United Kingdom who died during World War I or World War II. So it's very similar to what we have in America. It's just for Commonwealth countries. So they'll tell you here a bunch of, how you can search what they have. So again, I don't have anyone here, so I'm just going to put in a generic name and see what comes up. There we go. So you can see it's laid out pretty similarly to the American side. It'll have a name, their service number, their branch, date of death, and if we click on show more details here, they'll have a little more information about, how old they were, where they're buried, or where the memorial is. On this one, in this case, it'll have their parents' names and where they lived at the time. This was actually pretty common whenever there was a casualty, particularly around World War II. If someone died or was injured, it'll say their parents' names and where their parents lived. So this could be a useful bit of information. And this one will also have the inscription that's on their memorial or their headstone. All right, so we have two more specialized ones. So they're both for the Civil War. There's the National Graves Registration Database for Union veterans who died in the Civil War, and then the Confederate Graves Registry for Confederate veterans. So we're going to take a look at this one first, and we're going to look for Hosea again. So let's do that. Click on Search Grave Records. So pop in his name. Oh, and yes, they want you to prove that you're not a robot. There we go. So there's not as much information here. It'll just say what side they're on, what state they were from, but it will have their unit and where they are buried. So there'll be a little bit more in here. It'll tell you his date of death, and it'll tell you this information. He was a farmer. He died in West Stockbridge, so that is true. I can tell you from my own research, he was sick. He died of disease, but he was able to make it home before he passed. So he was pretty lucky as far as those things go. But this will give you some really good information. In some cases, it might tell you more about grave, but apparently not in this case. West Stockbridge is a pretty small town and it's a pretty small cemetery, so that information probably just wasn't available. And there's also the Confederate Graves Registry. So it's laid out pretty similarly. So again, I don't have anyone in this, so we're just going to do a generic name here. There we go. Okay. So you can see here, so if you see one in here that you like, again, much like the unit one, there's not a ton of information. Information just might not have been available, but this will tell you, in this case, it'll tell you their full name, when they were enlisted, their unit, their rank, birth and death dates. And then this one apparently integrates if they have a memorial and find a grave, it'll tell you which one that is, and it'll tell you some details about the cemetery. Oh, so someone has a name search. Okay, so John F. Knox. Okay, let's do a search for him. It comes up. No results from search. Okay, so we're just gonna try searching for John Knox. Okay, so there were a few. So judging by the middle name initial was F, I'm gonna guess it's this fellow from Louisiana. Please correct me if I'm wrong here. So let's look at him. So there we go. So this one, there's not a ton of information. He was in the 2nd Louisiana. Oh, okay, so this person, okay, so buried in Virginia from Georgia. Okay. So it looks like this is not the right person. So this person just might not be in here yet. That is true. Again, these are all based on when they find records, they'll put them in. So your person just might not be in here yet. But let's try. Someone else had a name, Lawrence. Okay. Not. Let's see what we have. No results. So again, that just means the information isn't in there yet. But definitely, so this is something definitely check back periodically to see if he's in there. So we're running a little long here. So we're not gonna linger too much over this. We have a lot of books on it. These are just 2 of them. This one I put in because I actually know the author. He's a really nice guy, very, very smart, definitely knows his stuff about cemeteries. So I like to promote his stuff whenever I can. And just to show you the cemetery subject heading in our catalog so you can get a sense of just how many we have. You can see we have 826 results about cemeteries. So some of them are just about cemeteries, but a lot of them will be records of different cemeteries. There's also be some that'll tell you about inscriptions or various different things. We have a ton of books about cemeteries, so definitely feel free to browse through this. So one thing I just want to go over fairly quickly is the Boston Historic Burying Grounds Initiative. So this is a city agency that manages the 15 historic cemeteries in Boston. So 5 of them are open daily from 9 to 4, but most of them are open by appointment only. So you would have to contact the office in the city to see and someone will meet you there with a key and they'll let you in. And none of these are active, so they are not accepting burials anymore. They do have a database of legible grave markers. Back in the 80s, they sent a bunch of interns out to all these cemeteries to make transcriptions of all the legible grave markers. This can be pretty useful because headstones that were legible in the 80s might not necessarily be legible anymore. So we're going to take a look here at Copp's Hill. So this will be, it'll be in alphabetical order. It'll tell you the date of burial, cemetery, and the plot name. So you might need to look at a map just to figure out what exactly this means, what the plot number is. So there's not a ton of information. This is just what they could read on the tombstone back in the 80s when they did this project. And there are currently 3 active public cemeteries in Boston. There's Mount Hope in Mattapan, Fairview in Hyde Park, and Evergreen in Brighton, which I live quite near, and I like to go walking through there sometimes. It's very, very nice. So if you're looking for Catholic cemeteries, as I mentioned a little bit ago, a lot of the dioceses will have their own offices devoted just to cemeteries. So there is a cemetery association of the Archdiocese of Boston. They look over 25 cemeteries and they handle all genealogy requests relating to burials. So if you're looking for a burial record, the Archdiocese of Boston, these are the people you want to contact. These are also the people you want to contact if you have a loved one that you need to bury at a Catholic cemetery here at one of the cemeteries they oversee. So you can get into a lot of information here. So you can do a burial search here. Again, do our generic name. There we go. So this will tell you where they're buried. So what's that actually say? Oh, that's weird. It doesn't say where these folks are. Okay, so that's interesting. Okay, So that's something, again, you can contact them about what exactly they have. And so all the other dioceses in Massachusetts have their own cemetery office. In Worcester, they just call it the St. John Cemetery System for some reason. So just some basic tips for cemetery records. If you're looking for a burial record, if you want to find where someone's buried, but you don't know where exactly they are, but you do know where they died, you can request their death certificate from the municipality where they lived. And death certificates should have the burial place listed. They might not have an exact plot, but they should at least have the name of the cemetery where they were buried, if they were buried in a cemetery. In the case where if you do know the cemetery, but you're not sure where they're buried within it, a lot of them will have their own websites, and some of them, if you're really fortunate, like the Mount Auburn Cemetery, they have a website that lists all their burials in there. Or you could just do a general search for the name of the cemetery, but you want to make sure you have the location. For instance, Mount Hope, there was a lot of Mount Hopes, so you would need to include the name of the town. So if you're looking for Boston, for the Boston Mount Hope, you want to put Mount Hope Cemetery, Boston. Another way you can go, if those things don't work out, you can search for the name or the location of the cemetery and the word association or friends, friends of. Sometimes these will be groups that will take over maintenance of a cemetery, or they donate money or can volunteer to try to keep it up. So again, if you know where a person is buried, but you don't have the exact plot, if the cemetery is still open, you want to contact the cemetery office. If the information is online, you might just have to go to the office, and whoever is running it can help you find the person you're looking for. And for inactive cemeteries who aren't accepting burials, you need to contact the organization that oversees it. So again, that could be a church, as we talked about before. It's the same with church records. That could be a church that took over the records of a closed church. It could be a city office, could be any number of things. Okay, so that's it for my presentation. So I see we have a few questions in here. We do have some time, so I'm gonna try to go back here. Okay, so Cindy is pointing out if a Catholic church closes, the records either go to the diocese or to the church that absorbed the closing church. Yes, that is absolutely correct. So that's something where you really need to, that's why the Catholic directories can be useful, because you need to trace what happened to that church. Okay, so Carol's asking, do we need to have residency in Massachusetts to access BPL info? Well, yes and no. So it depends. We do have some free resources on our website. However, you do need to live in Massachusetts in order to access our databases, because you need to at least have an e-card, and you do need to live in Massachusetts in order to access them. But we do take questions. You can call us, email us, send us a chat message when that's available. So we can help you out even if you live out of state. Okay, so Lauren is asking for clarification about copyrighted obituaries. So that is more for current obituaries. So it's just generally not a good idea. If you're someone who maintains memorials on Find a Grave, it's generally not a good idea to just copy and paste an obituary right into someone's memorial, particularly if it's not someone that you're related to or someone that you're very close to and that you were intimately involved with the funeral planning or anything like that. It's just generally not a good idea to do something like that. And some newspapers can be a little huffy about having something that they publish just freely available on something like Find a Grave. So I would just say, just be careful about that. I mean, if you want to put in something that you wrote about a loved one of yours that died and you're maintaining a memorial, I think that's probably fine, but it's just generally not a good idea to just copy and paste obituaries, especially for people you don't know. Someone did that for some of my loved ones, and it was really made me upset. So that's just something you don't want to do. Okay, let's see here. Okay, so Bunny is asking Muddy River, Elliott, Bering Ground, and Roxbury. So let's see. Not sure what the deal is with that, but let's find out. So that's one of the historic burying grounds. So that's something that you would need to, you can either try the historic burying ground database, but that actually, if you're having trouble with that, you can contact it's basically run by Parks and Recreation, the Historic Burying Grounds Initiative. So you would need to contact them if you're having trouble figuring out where exactly they are. So let me see. Of course. Okay. So then that is okay. So that's Parks and Recreation. So, all right. So these are the folks you would need to contact right here for the Elliott Burying Ground if you want to try to figure out where someone is over there. But yes, so generally, if you can't find it online, just contact the city office. Okay, so Nancy's asking, are there church records from the Black churches of Boston and Roxbury of the 1700s? Well, yeah, so it's just not specific to any type of church. As I said, everything I've said applies to all kinds of churches. It really depends. If the churches still exist, you'd want to contact the church. You can also just do a search for the name of the church. And you can do that in our catalog. If you have an example of the name of one, I'd be happy to do a search for that for you. You could do a search online. A lot of the times, more historic churches will have histories written that have been digitized and are available online, either in HathiTrust or the Internet Archives. So yes, there are records. But you just, again, it depends on denomination. They might be on an archive, they might be at a historical society, or if the church is still standing, they would have records. So really, again, it depends. Okay, let's see. Okay, so Nancy's asking, is there a guide to abbreviations used in church records? Yes, generally, in published records particularly, there will be an explanation of what all of the abbreviations mean at the beginning. And this is true in general for published records. In most cases, there will be a key that'll tell you what all the abbreviations they use mean. So if you're looking at a book, go to the front of the book. There should be a guide to what the abbreviations are. And every book is going to use its own system for abbreviation. So there isn't a general thing. So for published records, yes, but if for unpublished records, that's going to be a little trickier. You would probably need to talk to the organization that holds the records to find out what abbreviations they used. Okay. Yes. So Carol's saying that I would think that the current obituaries would have living persons who do not want their names on such sites. Yes, that's very, very true. Just in general, be careful on Find a Grave. Just be careful what you're doing on there. And I personally would stick to just having memorials for people I actually know. Like I have my grandfather's memorial on there. Someone else made one before I got a chance to, which again, kind of annoyed me. So again, just be very, very careful on there. Margaret's asking for BPL access. Isn't there now commuter access? And if you work or go to school in Massachusetts? Yes. So you can, if you live, work, or go to school or own property in Massachusetts, you can get an e-card, but you have to fit one of those criteria. If you don't, you won't be able to access things. Okay, so Richard's asking are there any webinars for people doing international searches? I don't currently have anything planned, and I don't know off the top of my head, but there's a few different places you could look. Let's see, Family History has, that's a website. They have a lot of tutorials on there. Ancestry.com has a lot of tutorials. There's also Roots Tech, which I think is fabulous. So if you can go to Roots Tech, they have a lot of videos online that are free. You do have to register for an account, but you can look at all sorts of videos on all sorts of topics, and they do cover international things. They do cover other countries and all sorts of things. So that's Roots Tech, and that's at Family Search. So I'm gonna just pop the link in there for you. And it's actually, their conference is coming up. So that's definitely, if you're interested in learning more, go ahead, and I would definitely recommend checking that out. Okay, so Maureen is asking, are Catholic school records accessible? So again, Catholic Church is a little tricky if they're not technically public records, like with public schools. So that's a little dicey. Again, as always, just with general schools, if the school is still open, check right with the school to see what they have. If they're not, you need to figure out where the diocese archive is and see what they have. But again, they don't legally have to release them to you. And I've heard a lot of stories from people who have had a lot of trouble trying to get records from Catholic archives. So it's just, again, something to keep in mind. Family tree webinars. That's actually the thing I was trying to think of. Thank you, Carol. So Carol recommends family tree webinars. That's actually what I was trying to think of, but I just couldn't get to the words there. Thank you, Carol. Yes, that's a great idea. Yes, they do have a lot of really great webinars on their site. Okay, so Randy's asking, how do you get records from Boston State Hospital? So I'm not sure who has that. Okay, so I think those might be at BU, but I'm not 100% sure. Let's see. Okay. Yeah, I don't know. Oh, it was UMass. Okay. Boston State Hospital. It looks like they. So just in general, if you're looking for like state hospitals, you can try the Massachusetts Archives. So that's the Massachusetts. The state archives has a lot. I don't know if they're going to have patient records. Those are a little trickier because record retention laws in the state, they might have been destroyed. So again, don't hold your breath on trying to find anything like that. They might still exist, but if it's old enough, they might not. All right. Okay, so that's all I see for questions in the chat. So we do have a couple more minutes. In the meantime, let's see, just a reminder, if you missed anything that I talked about, this class has been recorded and I will be sending a link to the recording to everyone once it's available. Everyone will also be getting a follow-up email from me tomorrow that will have the chat transcript as well as the handout and my slides. So don't be worried if you missed anything, you'll be able to catch it later. So I'm just gonna go ahead and promote our next couple programs. So our next class is using newspapers to research your ancestors. So this is my most requested thing. I do it once or twice a year, but I still get people wanting to do it. So happy to do it. So we're gonna be doing that. That is on November 8th. So that's coming up in a few weeks. And our next lecture in our local and family history speaker series is Naturalization Know-How Laws and Records of U.S. Citizenship. So we're going to have a guest speaker, Rich Venezia, talk about how to figure out naturalization records. So he's a wonderful speaker, and that's going to be on November 30th. So definitely check that out if that interests you. There'll be information about that in our follow-up email tomorrow, so you can get the link to register there. Okay, so it looks like we don't have any more questions. So thank you to everyone for coming, particularly those of you who hung in this long. I really appreciate it. Definitely, feel free to reach out if you have any questions. My contact information will be in one of the emails. If you have any questions, reference questions in general, that information is in the slides. So once again, thank you for coming. I hope everyone has a lovely weekend.